So one of the other proteins that we kind of discussed in our protein function chapter was the proteins that are involved in Alzheimer disease. And so I'm going to go through some of the slides that we talked about today in class. Again, there's a great video here that kind of goes through kind of the pathophysiology for how Alzheimer's disease progresses. So a great video there that we have up on Edpuzzle for that. But to kind of start with where things start with this is we have a protein called APP, and the function of this is not well understood. The thought is it does hopefully play some sort of role in kind of normal neuronal function. But there are some secretase enzymes that can take and cleave this APP protein out of the lipid bilayer that it lives in, and it can create these 36 to 43 amino acid short peptides, which we call A beta. These short peptides can be very soluble, but then when they aggregate, they become these insoluble plaques. And so we might ask the question about why is this happening? Why would we be taking a protein that's embedded in a lipid bilayer, cleaving it up into pieces, and then potentially allowing those pieces to aggregate? Well, in a normal sense, this might be just part of normal cellular turnover. If that cell undergoes apoptosis and we need to recycle the parts, you're going to have to break down that protein. So it can be just part of that normal process. Where we're interested in this conversation here is that it might be a response to what we're going to call an acute insult. And again, the difference between acute and chronic: acute is meant to be something that's short term. And we'll talk about in our next slide kind of what these insults are. But again, a short-term solution might be the creation of these A beta plaques. So again, these insoluble plaques might be a way that your body is serving to protect itself. These A beta plaques are things that are being produced all the time in your body. And your glymphatic system within your brain is a really important system that allows for you to clear these plaques. And so that highlights kind of the importance of good sleep, because your glymphatic system is very active when you're sleeping. So here's another kind of connection to something that we've talked about already. The ability to clear these plaques is negatively correlated with the ApoE4 genotype. That is, if you have the ApoE4 allele, specifically if you have 2 copies of that, you have a decreased ability to clear these plaques, and so you'll have an increase in plaque accumulation, and that's part of the reason why people who are ApoE4 have an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. Just a couple of other things to kind of highlight here as we have sort of this mechanism up here is that there's often discussion about, well, how could we use drug therapies to intervene with the progression of Alzheimer's disease? And the thought is that there are some drugs that serve to inhibit these beta and gamma secretase enzymes. So if we can decrease the production of these A beta peptides, that would be an upstream way to interfere with the production of these plaques. Similarly, if we have ways that we can interfere with this aggregation step, that's also a way to interfere with the production of these plaques. So I wanted to kind of highlight and discuss a little bit further what we mean by these insults, if you will. So again, kind of highlighting the fact that these plaques might be something beneficial in the short term that allows your body to respond to acute insults and preserve brain function. So again, what are these insults and how are they problematic? There's some great research out there that kind of highlights the different kinds of insults that we might have. And one of them that we can think about is what we call inflammatory or hot insults. There's so many kind of triggers that we can think about that cause systemic inflammation in the body. Remember, inflammation in the body is not always a bad thing if it is acute. You have, a paper cut and it gets infected and your body kind of responds to that by having an inflammatory response, and that helps your body heal. So acute inflammation is not problematic. Chronic inflammation is what is problematic. And so chronic inflammation can be an insult that can result in the increase of these A beta plaques, right? And again, this is meant to be a short-term protection, allowing the brain to sort of downsize itself, have a smaller functional space, and kind of allow it to ride out this acute insult, right? So inflammation can be sort of an acute insult. Deficiencies are what are referred to as kind of a cold type of an Alzheimer's. And if you have a deficiency, that means you kind of have the lack of support for kind of full system function. So insulin resistance can be thought of as a deficiency in your body to handle blood sugar. So again, these two pieces together, elevated glucose levels, which are inflammatory, and insulin resistance represents a deficiency in your kind of energy metabolism pathway, are why Alzheimer's disease is often referred to as type 3 diabetes. So again, other deficiencies might include vitamin deficiencies such as vitamin D and so forth. All of those represent insults that allow you to not be operating at full capacity, so your brain might want to downsize a little bit to better function in a smaller space. Kind of a different way to look at things might be toxin exposure. So whether they're heavy metals, whether they're mycotoxins from molds, whether it's viral or bacterial infections, toxin exposures can also represent an insult that your body tries to protect itself from by the production of plaques. Lastly, and sort of not quite related to this, but something that we talked about in class, right? Physical trauma, these traumatic brain injuries. Having physical trauma can represent an insult, probably because it creates some type of an inflammatory response. But again, the incidence of people with ApoE4 and their ability to productively respond to traumatic brain injury is impaired, and it's probably because of the inability to clear these A beta plaques. All right, so we've got these insults, which again, your body's production of plaques are a way to deal with this in the short term. But what if these insults aren't acute? What if this inflammation becomes chronic? What if this deficiency becomes long-term? What if your toxin exposure becomes something that is not acute? How do we handle that? Right? So chronic insults allow accumulation of these A beta plaques to reach a tipping point. Right? And there's lots of things that can influence your tipping point. So there's, again, a great TED Talk here by Lisa Genova, wrote a book called Still Alice. And she talks about kind of reaching your tipping point, reaching a level of plaque formation that becomes all of a sudden, pathogenic in terms of disease progression. So thinking about what influences your tipping point and then what you can do to mitigate that. Well, again, your genetics might be something that predisposes you, that tips you, that allows you to reach that tipping point sooner. Your age might be something that tips you sooner. But there's lots of things that are lifestyle related that, again, might influence your tipping point. Maybe you have a very inflammatory diet. Maybe you don't exercise sufficiently. Maybe you have elevated stress. Maybe you don't sleep very well. So these are things that are hackable. These are things that you can mitigate your response to as a way to influence your tipping point, right? So reduce the amount of inflammation your diet's causing. Increase the amount of exercise that can help with that lymphatic system, as can increasing the amount of sleep you have, right? Decreasing the amount of stress is a way to kind of also help mitigate this. But one of the things that's really neat that Lisa talks about in her TED Talk is the ability to develop new neural networks, right? And that's a way to increase kind of the functional capacity of your brain. And it's not, as she mentions, doing crossword puzzles or doing the same kind of repetitive mind activities over and over again. It's doing something new, learning something new, learning a new instrument, reading a new book, doing something that allows you to use your brain in a new and different way can be a great way to help mitigate the progression of this disease.